Hi, can you hear me? I guess you can. Welcome. Very nice to be with you here today, um, here in Silverberg. Now, for those of you that don't know, Silverberg in English is actually Iceland spar, and or Iceland crystal, and it was used by the Vikings to navigate. Even in the 16th century, when the compass had been invented, they are still finding Iceland spar in shipwrecks. So hopefully this will help me, being here, navigate the slide deck that we have. So my name is Magnús Björnsson. I'm the CEO of Men&Mice, and I'm going to talk about network management in a hybrid and multi-cloud world. Now let's take a step back and look at the early days of corporate networks. You had really expensive computing power. You had machines that typically took a whole room in a building with a very small and limited number of devices. Typically, it was kind of 2 machines and a printer. So there was really no need for extensive network management at the time. Now, if we go yesterday, and yesterday kind of loosely speaking, I'm talking 20, 25 years ago or so, this is when the on-premise started to become popular. You saw data centers popping up left and right. The building, the room in a building became maybe multiple rooms in a building. And you started to see the tooling that we even use still today being created. Now, compare that to today, when we have the cloud. We see exponential growth of devices. One of our customers has over 200,000 subnets, and on each subnet, you have hundreds or even thousands of devices. With both on-premise and cloud, the management becomes significantly more complex. How do you build automation when you need to span both on-premise and cloud? And more than that, you need to span not just one cloud provider, but multiple cloud providers. So that is a challenge. And if you think about tomorrow, I have some news for you. This growth, this evolution that's been happening is only going to become faster and faster. Networks are evolving, getting larger and larger. So it's so important to build infrastructure, to build management capabilities that evolve with you. Now, if you look at these words there in this word cloud, it may ring a bell. Automation, digital transformation, IPv6, SASE. These are all tools, technologies that are becoming more and more prevalent. DevOps is a key thing that any network manager needs to think about. So, computing power and storage have kind of become commodities today. You can charge with a credit card with one of those cloud providers and get pretty powerful machines and storage for pretty cheap. So they're kind of hidden behind the cloud. What is apparent, what is visible, what you need to manage more and more is actually the network. And now they're no longer confined to the local on-premise environment. So it doesn't make sense to use the same tooling and manage like you used to yesterday. You need to evolve, you need to change. So Sun Microsystem is a company that was around for quite a bit, and they did some really impressive things. L. Peter Deutsch was a fellow at Sun, and his colleague James Gosling, I don't know if you know that name, but if you know Java, well, he's the father of Java. So those guys thought really hard about how to build reliable, robust distributed systems. And they created these 8 fallacies of distributed systems. So if you're building a distributed system, make sure you avoid these fallacies. The first one is that the network is reliable. It's not. And you have to assume it's not reliable. You have drop package, you have network partitions, and the infrastructure needs to support that those things will happen. The latency of requests is not, and actually will never be, zero. And as your global network is expanding, latency becomes more and more of an issue. Bandwidth. Now, bandwidth has improved significantly over the past 10, 20 years, but it's not infinite, and it'll never be infinite. This is a good one. This one you probably recognize. The network is not secure. It'll never be really secure. Topology doesn't change. So just this move from on-premise to cloud tells us topology does change, and it is changing. So the move from on-prem to cloud, then from one cloud provider to the next cloud provider, and then from one cloud provider back to on-prem. This is what's happening. This is what has been talked about even here today in earlier lectures, repatriation. There's one admin. Well, it used to be true. There used to be the admin, but now, no. You have tens, hundreds, even thousands of active admins that have different responsibilities, different access, so having fine-grained access controls is key. Transport cost is zero. It's not. I mean, in the end, we all have a budget that we need to adhere to. So we need to take that into account. And last but not least, the network is homogeneous. So how many of you, just by show of hands, how many of you actually have homogeneous networks, meaning your infrastructure is all from the same provider? So nobody. One person, okay, one person. Well, lucky you, but you are one of the few. And the thing is, as time goes by, as your network starts to grow, it becomes harder and harder to make sure your network is homogeneous. I'm actually going to come back to that point a little bit later. So, I was visiting Stockholm last year, and I went to Epicenter. It's kind of this innovation hub in Stockholm where you have small companies innovating, you have this shared enthusiasm of creating new things. But there was also an office from one of the largest banks in Sweden. Good for them. So when we talked to them, they said, yeah, we wanted to escape the corporate shackles and be in the same area as these innovative startups that do innovative things. We wanted to move faster, which is great. That's awesome. And then when we asked them, okay, that sounds awesome. That sounds great. What happens now when you take these new things that you create and take them back to the mothership? And you could kind of see them grimace a bit and go, yeah, that's been a challenge. And you want to guess what team has been responsible for stepping on the brakes the most? Well, it kind of says there on the slide. It's the IT team. It's the networking team. Because they have their policies, they have their own responsibility. So if some upstart comes along with some idea for a new product, well, they need to abide by our rules of the IT domain. And this is a challenge for businesses. Because this, in effect, reverses the control direction, that now IT is defining business limits. This is something companies really don't want or should think twice about. So what needs to happen is that companies need to change their mindset for managing networks. They need to move from ecosystem or ecosystem-centered thinking to objective-focused mindsets. So we at Men&Mice, we've been in the industry for 30 years. We actually turned 30 this year. And we've had some success dealing with these things by something we call compound network management. And the core idea is pretty simple. It's basically decoupling the control plane from the underlying hardware and software. And we're not the only ones doing this. There are actually a lot of companies that do this. And keep in mind that our focus is really, really narrow. It is DNS, DHCP, and IPAM. But this approach allows companies, businesses, to drive decisions and innovate without really being shackled by hardware and software ecosystems. This helps them be back-end agnostic, avoiding lock-in. So DNS, DHCP, and IPAM. How many of you know what those terms mean, just out of curiosity? So about 25%. Well, for the 75% of you, you're lucky. You get to learn that today. So DNS, DHCP, and IPAM is a small but really critical subset responsible for orchestrating activity on, across, and between networks. Now, if I make a phone call, what do I need to know to make that phone call? Well, I need a phone number, right? If I want to call my friend Torvi here, right? I need to know his number. And I'm pretty awful with the numbers, but I'm lucky because I have something called a phone directory. So all I have to do is press Torvi's name, and it'll connect me with him. Well, computers work the same way. To be able to connect and interact, you need the equivalent of a phone number. You need an IP address, or Internet Protocol address. It's kind of like a phone number for computers. And just like with computers, you want something that's easy to remember. I mean, who knows the IP address for Netflix.com? Nobody, right? Because you know Netflix.com. It's sufficient. Well, that's what DNS does. DNS basically is the phone directory for the internet. It maps from a name to an IP address. And then the last piece there, DHCP, that is the software or service responsible for allocating IP addresses dynamically. So IP addresses, anything to do with IP addresses, this is the core part of your network. And this is what Men&Mice, this is this level of network stack where the Men&Mice suite and our products operate. Now, this is sometimes called DDI. It's basically the first letter of each name. So D, DNS, D, DHCP, and I, IPAM, DDI. So if the network is the nervous system, DDI is kind of like the nerve center. And what happens when the nerve center fails? Well, the nervous system goes haywire. So if DDI, if DNS, DHCP, and IPAM, if that fails, then you have a partial or even complete network failure, which actually leads to business failure. I don't know if you remember, late 2016, Netflix, Twitter, Airbnb, and a bunch of banks, they vanished off the face of the internet for hours. What failed? What happened? Well, DNS. Their DNS provider or the DNS service was brought down by a DDoS attack. So they effectively vanished off the face of the internet. And this is what happened if you do not take care of your core basic services. Now, there are 3 case studies that I kind of want to walk us through here that demonstrate the value of an approach of compound networks. This is something we've had reasonable success in delivering to our customers. The first is migration from old, inefficient infrastructure and enabling cloud capabilities. The second one is unlocking multi-cloud benefits in a global and a heterogeneous environments. And last one is Internet of Things, big data. So let's talk about legacy network infrastructure. Companies, especially large companies, have different business divisions. And each business division requires certain services to be able to innovate and create new services and new products. And those services require DNS, DHCP, and IP addresses. So in many cases, it is highly inefficient and very time-consuming to get those. How do you make sure that you have visibility and compatibility across all your networks? How do you ensure that there are no disconnects between on-prem and cloud services? So these are the kinds of challenges that you have to deal with when you have legacy infrastructure. Now, this case revolves around a Fortune 500 company. It's heavy in R&D with fast-changing production sites across the entire globe. They had centralized DDI management with a workforce that had multiple SLA with different business units. Significant overhead in terms of expense for this admin. So what they wanted to do was migrate the management controls and their core IP infrastructure, DNS, DHCP, and IPAM, to a more efficient platform. They wanted to improve the efficiency and reduce the administrative overhead. What they did was bring in Men&Mice, and by migrating to the Men&Mice infrastructure, it allowed them to redeploy 80% of the personnel that was previously dedicated towards DDI management. They implemented workflows and automation and drastically shortened SLAs for all business divisions. Number of related support tickets actually went from 500 a month to 0. This literally saved them millions of dollars. The second case I want to talk about is getting a handle on infrastructure sprawl. Now, when you are a large multinational corporation, you go through sometimes multiple acquisitions, or you acquire companies, multiple companies, every single year. Now, what happens to your network? This is sometimes an unintended consequence or side effect of acquisition. Because now you end up with kind of the mother network of the acquirer and the network of the acquiree, and you now have to manage both of them. And this becomes more and more of a challenge. And this is very often that you end up with non-homogeneous environments. You end up with a network that is basically a patchwork of different networks that are glued together with homegrown patches. So this particular case is a global education company. They create digital textbooks, instructor supplements, distance learning courses, test preparation, and corporate training courses. It's actually a 5,000 employee company worldwide in over 38 countries. Revenues just under $2 billion. It's actually in the top 15 of the world's largest book publishers. And they've been through 9 major acquisitions in the last 12 years. So they had a challenge. They had incompatible platforms. They had no visibility into all their environments. Significant case of infrastructure sprawl. So by bringing an overlay offering, it allowed them a single pane of glass management with a single unified API of all their heterogeneous environments. They didn't have to swap out anything else. And yet, it allowed them to migrate on demand when they wanted with pretty much no risk involved. It could all be automated through the API. And this breached or spanned multiple cloud environments. They were using AWS, they were using Azure, and they were using on-prem. True single pane of glass over all their environments. Now, this last case that I want to talk about has to do with IoT and big data, where you have thousands of connected devices. And this is a case where being up and running always really matters. These are actually our friends at the Icelandic National Meteorological Office. They have about 1,000 sensors all over Iceland, measuring rainfall, wind, and seismic activities, and giving given the news over the past few weeks, actually having those up and running always really matters. It can actually save lives. Now, the challenge here was that when you were deploying these devices or maintaining those devices, it took hours of manual work, manual error-prone work by the networking team to actually do the migration or do the deployment, which is a challenge. So they brought us on board, and with Men&Mice, they actually managed to shrink that down to minutes with the possibility of even further automation to bring it down to seconds. Now, to recap, there are new network paradigms popping up every day, and that will continue. We're not stopping here. So making sure that the tooling evolves with your networking needs is critical. You need to be as future-proof as possible. And in our opinion, true, we may be biased, the only way to do that is an abstraction layer that unifies visibility and control over the entire corporate compound network. So the approach that some alternative vendors take, which is that, oh, no problem, you just swap out all the infrastructure you have and you put our stuff in there, is just not tenable for the long run. The network is and will never be homogeneous. Assume it's heterogeneous and build the tooling to support that. So compound network management gives you this global view of all your environments. It's transparent, it's balanced. It allows you to migrate resources on demand and gives you unified control, and in the end, it's more secure. Justice Louis Brandeis, he was a Supreme Court judge in the US, he said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that also applies to networking. Visibility is really the best way and the first step towards better security. Now, I'll be happy to take questions after. I'll be sticking around for a few minutes, but that's all I have. So thank you and have a nice day.